For more than 50 years, something extremely creepy happened to 4 generations of one of the most famous racing families in history. This is the Andretti curse. For multiple generations, the Andretti family have raced almost every single major formula on 4 wheels. Wherever there's a race worth winning, an Andretti has probably turned up at some point, and usually they've been pretty damn successful. Mario Andretti is the jewel of this dynasty and undoubtedly one of the greatest drivers to ever have lived. He's one of the very few drivers in history to stand out in numerous top disciplines. He won in Formula 1, NASCAR, Endurance, IndyCar, dirt racing, sprint cars and, well, you kind of get the point, he was good. But for all this success, there's one race that Mario and his family are synonymous with, for the wrong reasons. The Indy 500. It's a legacy-defining race, and since 1911 it has developed an almost mythical status. It's one of the biggest sporting events in the world, and with over 300,000 fans filling the speedway on race day, the atmosphere is incredible, and the entire city of Indianapolis has built its identity around it. But before we go on, just a quick word on the Andretti family themselves, because long before they became American royalty, the Andrettis were actually refugees. After the Second World War, the Andretti family fled Istria during the post-war exodus. The family spent several years living in a refugee camp in Lucca in Italy. Eventually, in 1955, the family emigrated to the United States, and it was here where the Andretti brothers, Mario and Aldo, fell in love with their local dirt tracks. Good old American short track racing is rough, dirty and dangerous, but it also produces brilliant drivers. And Mario was a natural. Before long, the little Italian immigrant had become one of America's brightest young prospects. And by the early 60s he was already winning sprint car and midget races and even championships. The talent was unquestionable, and inevitably it wasn't long before he ended up in IndyCar racing. Sadly for his brother Aldo, he suffered a string of bad crashes, one of which put him in a coma and another of which caused him terrible facial injuries, and he retired from racing early in 1969. Mario meanwhile had made his Indy 500 debut in 1965. He'd immediately qualified on the second row, won Rookie of the Year and finished in third in the race. He was well on the way to becoming America's next big racing superstar. 4 years later, after some solid first seasons in the series, Mario followed this up with victory in the Indy 500 in 1969, the same year that his brother had retired. One of America's newest heroes had conquered America's greatest race. For many people it looked likely to be the first of many, but nobody could have known that it would become the beginning of one of the most bizarre stories in motor racing history. Now, before I go on, please do consider subscribing if you want to hear more stories like this one. Following Mario's 1969 victory, a bitter disagreement split his team owner Andy Granatelli and his chief mechanic Clint Brawner. Brawner was fired, but Mario chose to stay with Granatelli. In retaliation, Brawner's wife Kay allegedly visited a fortune teller and cast a hex promising that an Andretti would never ever win an Indianapolis 500 ever again. It sounds ridiculous, but what followed was to be many decades of terrible luck. Not just for Mario, but for the entire Andretti family. To begin with, for the following years, nobody really questioned it. Mario suffered from retirement or accidents or simply a lack of pace, but that can happen to anyone, and he was still winning other races and championships all over the world, so it seemed inevitable that eventually he'd just get another Indy 500 victory. But then, 1981 happened. At the 1981 Indy 500, Bobby Unser actually crossed the finish line first, and Mario followed him home in second place. It wasn't quite a win, but a very respectable finish. However, officials determined that Bobby Unser had illegally passed cars while the field was under caution, and so after review Unser was disqualified from the result, and Mario was handed his second victory. As everyone expected, he'd scooped his second win, and there was no talk of curses at all. But Unser's team appealed the result. It was a case that dragged on for months, until eventually the appeal board overturned the penalty, and Bobby Unser was given the win again. Even today, fans argue over whether the officials got it right, or maybe they'd been visited by a witch in the dead of the night. As the 1980s continued, Mario remained incredibly competitive, given that he was now in his 40s. Most drivers would have retired by now, but Mario seemed determined to power on. But still, the elusive second Indy 500 failed to emerge, including at the famous 1985 running, where leader Danny Sullivan spun at 200 miles per hour, but somehow managed to keep it out of the wall. Mario finished behind him in second, again. And then in 1987, Mario completely dominated the race. He was in a different lead to anyone else, leading 170 of the first 177 laps. But then, with just 23 laps to go, a valve spring broke. And that was that. For 47-year-old Mario Andretti, it was one of the great IndyCar heartbreaks. And for many fans, it was the afternoon where the Andretti curse really started to feel real. By this point, it wasn't just Mario representing the family name in the sport. Both his sons, Michael and Jeff, were also establishing themselves, with Michael in particular looking seriously impressive. Michael was winning races at an incredible rate and was already following his father's footsteps in becoming one of the stars of American racing. So surely if Mario couldn't break the Indy 500 curse, it would only be a matter of time before Michael did. But before I go on, if you're enjoying this video, please do give it a quick like, it really does help. Now, Michael's debut came in the race in 1984 at the age of 21. And his first years in the race were met with pretty solid but unspectacular results. But then came 1989. At this point, Michael had arguably become the quickest driver in the series. He arrived with a real chance of victory and everything was coming together beautifully. By late in the race, he was leading comfortably. But then, with just about 20% of the race left, the engine failed. For an Andretti, it was a familiar tale. But if 1989 hurt, 1991 probably hurt even more. Once again, Michael was on top form, leading 97 laps and had built up a comfortable lead. But then, with 13 laps to go, a caution flag bunched up the field, and following the restart he ended up behind Rick Mears. In a moment of controversy, his father Mario broke down and stopped at the pit entry, bringing out yet another caution, with some accusing Mario of doing it on purpose to create yet another restart so that Michael had an opportunity to try and pass Mears. But it was a moot point, as Mears was able to take off on the restart and take the checkered flag. And if that wasn't enough pain, along came the infamous 1992 race. For the Andretti family, this one pretty much summed up the curse. Mario Andretti was now 52 years old and still competing, which in itself is an insane achievement. Sadly though, early in the race he suffered a violent crash and left the track with broken toe and foot injuries. And then disaster struck again. Jeff Andretti, Mario's younger son, had an even worse crash and suffered an enormous impact which shattered both his legs. He too was taken to the same hospital. Despite the distraction of his father and brother's accidents, Michael was once again absolutely flying. His performance was mesmerising and he led 160 laps by the point of only 11 laps to go, and he was leading by half a lap. Finally, the curse seemed like it was about to end, but then his fuel pump failed and once again it was game over. Mario, who was in hospital with his son Jeff while this played out, later described the day as the worst of his life. For Jeff, he'd made a typically strong start to his career, but sadly these injuries would destroy any potential of that career. At this point, even the skeptics were starting to think that there must be something to this curse. And somehow, it still wasn't finished, because another young Andretti was growing up watching all of this unfold. His name was Marco Andretti, and unbelievably his first attempt at breaking the curse would come closer than anyone could possibly imagine. As the son of Michael, it was inevitable that Marco would become a racing driver, and given the family name, expectations were high. And Marco's rookie season in 2006 was extraordinary. He was just 19 years old, and in his first attempt at the Indy 500, he looked completely at home. Throughout practice and qualifying, his pace impressed everyone, and come race day he was racing at the standard his father and grandfather had set for decades prior. By the closing stages he was fighting for victory. He was battling wheel to wheel with the top drivers at the time. The end of the Indy 500 often becomes a chess match of slipstream and overtaking, and incredibly, as they headed into the final lap, young Marco was leading. For the Andretti family, they must have finally thought this was it. Dozens of heartbreaks, hundreds of laps led, countless mechanical failures. Surely this would be it. Marco continued to hold his own, and he rounded the final bend with the checkered flag in sight. The crowd were on their feet, the commentators were roaring. And then, Sam Hornish Jr. made his move. He used the draft perfectly to pull alongside Marco, and it became a drag race to the line. Both cars screamed through almost completely level. The gap between the two drivers was 0.0635 seconds over the finish line, and once again, an Andretti had finished second. At this point, the Andretti curse was accepted as almost folklore. Marco would go on to race many more times, but he would never come as close again. It's also worth mentioning John Andretti, who was Mario's nephew and his brother Aldo's son. His misfortunes in the race weren't as dramatic as the rest of the family, but his results were notably mediocre. And then there's also Mario's infamous testing run in 2003. At the grand old age of 67, Mario Andretti stepped out of retirement and into Tony Kanaan's car for a session, due to Tony being out with an injury. Despite his age, he was remarkably quick, but late in the session he struck debris from an earlier crash and launched into an enormous flip. I could go on here and run through countless other misfortunes for the family, but to be honest, I'd probably be here all day. So in total, between the 5 drivers mentioned in this video, the Andretti family have made 80 starts at the Indy 500. In nearly half of those, they retired from the race. In numerous instances, one of them has led the most laps of any driver in the race, and in fact Michael holds the record for the most laps led in the Indy 500 without a victory. But yet, to this day, the only Andretti victory is Mario's win in 1969, after which, a few months later, the curse was set. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one on screen about the legend that is Kyle Busch.